Have you ever felt like you had to prove yourself, even to the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? Let me tell you about Isaac. Isaac Carter had spent most of his life in the shadow of his father's legacy. James Carter, a self-made billionaire, was the founder and CEO of Carter Industries, a powerhouse in the corporate world. From the outside, their family appeared to have it all: wealth, influence, and success. But behind the marble walls of their estate, Isaac knew a different reality. James had never been an easy man to please. He valued hard work above all else. But to him, success meant following his footsteps, playing by the rules of the business world. Isaac, however, had always been different. He wasn't content with a life of boardrooms and business meetings. He wanted something more, something real. His father dismissed his ideas, calling them naive, and time after time, Isaac was made to feel like an outsider in his own family. "I built this empire from nothing, Isaac." James would remind him, "Do you think you can just waltz in and change the rules?" Isaac had tried. He had spent years earning degrees in business, finance, even leadership, trying to impress his father, but nothing ever seemed to be enough. His ideas were brushed aside in meetings. His suggestions met with skepticism. Then came the breaking point. One evening, during a formal company dinner, James stood before a crowd of investors and employees, praising his leadership team. When Isaac's name was conveniently left out, he felt the familiar sting of disappointment. Gathering his courage, he approached his father afterward. "Dad, I just don't understand. You never give me a real chance." James sighed, swirling the scotch in his glass. "Isaac, you've never had to struggle. You don't know what it takes." The words cut deep. His father saw him as nothing more than a privileged son, someone who could never grasp the weight of real responsibility. That night, Isaac made a decision, one that would change everything. If his father wouldn't see his worth from behind a desk, maybe he'd have to prove it another way. A week later, with a plan in mind, Isaac walked into Carter Industries, not as the heir to the company, but as an ordinary janitor, with a fake name and a uniform. He would work at the lowest level of the empire his father had built. No special treatment, no favors. He wanted to see the company through the eyes of the people who kept it running from the ground up. But what he discovered in those hallways was far beyond what he had expected. The late-night shifts in dimly lit hallways, the muffled conversations behind closed office doors. Slowly, Isaac started to see cracks in the company's perfect image. Employees whispered about unfair policies, ruthless supervisors, and a toxic work culture that his father seemed oblivious to. He watched as managers berated workers, exploiting their desperation to keep their jobs. The more he saw, the harder it became to ignore. And then one night, he stumbled upon something truly shocking, something that would make him question everything he thought he knew about Carter Industries. But he wasn't just any janitor. He was the CEO's son. And soon they would all find out. For the first few weeks, Isaac kept his head down, blending into the background like any other janitor. He arrived before dawn, mopping the polished hallways, emptying trash cans overflowing with discarded coffee cups, and wiping down conference rooms after high-powered meetings. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the office politics, the quiet gossip, and, most importantly, the way people talk about his father, the CEO. At first, he thought it would be a straightforward task: observe, understand, and maybe gain insight into his father's world. But as time passed, Isaac started to see a different reality. The employees at the bottom rungs of the company, janitors, clerks, interns, were invisible. The higher-ups barely acknowledged their existence. He heard cruel jokes in the break room, saw employees like him get dismissed with a wave of a hand, and, worst of all, he saw the way the vice president, Thomas Grayson, wielded his power like a weapon. Grayson was a man who thrived on control. His presence alone could silence a room. He was sharp-dressed, always in expensive suits that smelled of arrogance and wealth. His words cut like blades, always laced with an undertone of mockery. He treated subordinates with impatience, speaking to them as if they were children fumbling in a world meant for men like him. Isaac quickly realized that his father's company wasn't the empire of fairness and innovation he had imagined. Grayson and his closest executives saw employees as tools, useful only when they contributed to profits. The janitorial staff, like Isaac, were nothing but shadows in the hallways. One evening, Isaac stayed late, finishing up in the executive lounge. The office had mostly emptied out, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of the vending machines and the occasional typing from a few overworked employees burning the midnight oil. That's when he overheard them, Grayson and a few others, lounging in the sleek leather chairs, drinks in hand, laughing about the upcoming round of layoffs. Dead weight, Grayson sneered. These people expect handouts, like we owe them something. The company isn't charity. Isaac felt a surge of anger. These were people with families, with bills to pay, with dreams. And yet, to Grayson, they were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Then, Grayson shifted the conversation, his voice dropping slightly. "And the old man's getting soft," he muttered, referring to Isaac's father. "He doesn't have it in him anymore. If he keeps making these sentimental decisions, we may have to step in." Isaac's breath hitched. Was Grayson suggesting something more? A takeover? A betrayal? As he processed the words, his grip on the mop tightened, and the bucket beside him clattered against the floor. The noise shattered the conversation, and suddenly, for pairs of eyes turned to him, Grayson's gaze narrowed. "You," he snapped. "What are you doing here?" Isaac's heart pounded. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the sharp-edged suspicion. He kept his head down, lowering his voice. "Just cleaning, sir." Grayson's lips curled into a smirk. "Of course. That's all you people do." The room erupted in laughter. Isaac clenched his jaw, the humiliation burning his skin. He knew, at that moment, that he was nothing to them. Nothing but a janitor. But what they didn't know, what Grayson didn't know, was that Isaac was far more than that, and he was going to prove it. The weight of humiliation had stayed with Isaac for days, sinking into his skin like a permanent stain. But tonight, everything would change. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. The office was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of janitors finishing their work. Isaac was in the main conference hall, wiping down the long glass table, when he heard voices. Sharp, urgent. He froze. "We move forward with a plan," Grayson was saying. "The board doesn't need his approval. If the old man won't step down, we'll make him." Isaac's blood ran cold. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. "Once he's out, I take the reins," Grayson continued, his voice smooth with confidence. "We cut the dead weight, push through the expansions, and finally turn this place into something profitable. No more sentimentality, no more charity cases." A murmur of agreement followed. Isaac's pulse pounded against his temples. This wasn't just greed. It was betrayal. His father had built this company from the ground up, and now Grayson planned to rip it from his hands. Before he could think, before he could talk himself down, Isaac stepped into the room. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. The room fell silent. Grayson turned, amusement flickering across his face before it twisted into a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who thinks he belongs in the grown-ups' conversation." Isaac took a step forward, fists clenched. "This isn't business. This is a coup." Grayson laughed. "And what are you going to do about it? Clean the floors a little harder?" The executives chuckled, the sound grating against Isaac's nerves. Isaac forced himself to keep his breathing steady. "You really think my father will stand for this?" Grayson's smirk deepened. "Your father?" His voice dripped with mockery. "You really don't get it, do you? He's weak. The board knows it. He's already lost." Isaac felt his nails bite into his palms. His father wasn't weak. He was the only reason this company had survived this long. Grayson took a step closer, towering over him. "You're nothing here," he said softly, his voice like a knife. "A janitor. An insect. And insects don't get to challenge men like me." Isaac's throat tightened. The weight of powerlessness crashed down on him. He wanted to fight back, to wipe the smug expression off Grayson's face. But what could he do? He was outnumbered, outranked, and no one in this room would stand with him. For the first time, doubt sank its claws into him. Maybe he really was just a janitor. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Is that how you talk to employees, Mr. Grayson?" The air shifted. Isaac turned. So did everyone else. His father stood in the doorway, dressed sharply in his usual tailored suit. He looked every bit the powerful CEO the world had once known. But there was something else in his eyes now, something fierce. Grayson's confident smirk faltered. "Mr. Whitmore," he said smoothly, recovering quickly, "you weren't supposed to be here." Isaac's father stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "Clearly," he said. "But imagine my surprise when I got an anonymous tip about a secret meeting happening in my own company." Isaac felt his chest tighten. Anonymous tip? He hadn't told anyone. Then he saw her, standing just behind his father. Sarah, the receptionist, the only person who had ever treated Isaac with kindness. She met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Isaac swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. His father turned his attention back to Grayson. "Would you care to explain why my vice president is discussing my removal behind closed doors?" Grayson hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, with the practiced ease of a man used to controlling narratives, he straightened. "Mr. Whitmore, I assure you, this is nothing more than a discussion about the future of the company. We all want what's best." His father tilted his head. "What's best?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "I built this company from the ground up, and yet here you are plotting to take it away." Grayson's mask slipped. "This company needs change," he snapped. "You refuse to evolve. You keep employees who should have been cut years ago. You waste resources. The board agrees that it's time for a transition." Isaac's father took another step forward, voice calm but edged with steel. "And that's why you treat people like garbage? Because they don't serve your vision?" Grayson's lip curled. "I do what needs to be done." For the first time, Isaac's father looked at him, not as a janitor, but as a son. "What do you think, Isaac?" Silence. Isaac's throat tightened. His hands shook at his sides. He thought of the mocking laughter, the way Grayson had belittled him, the way employees like him were treated like they didn't matter. He lifted his chin. "I think, Grayson, is everything wrong with this company?" Grayson scoffed. "That's rich coming from a janitor." Isaac didn't hesitate. "No, that's rich coming from someone who thinks leadership is about stepping on the people beneath him." Grayson's face darkened. Isaac turned to the other executives in the room. "You've all heard how he talks about you. Do you really think he cares about any of you? The moment you stop being useful, he'll throw you away just like he does everyone else." Murmurs rippled through the room. Doubt, uncertainty. Isaac's father nodded. "You're right." He turned to the executives. "Grayson has no place here." Grayson's expression twisted with rage. "You can't." "I can," his father interrupted. "And I just did." Security entered the room. Grayson's face drained of color. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Isaac met his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I won't." As Grayson was escorted out, the tension in the room finally broke. Isaac let out a shaky breath. He wasn't just a janitor. And now, the whole world knew it. Grayson was gone. For the first time in weeks, Isaac could breathe. The tension that had coiled inside him like a spring finally loosened as security escorted Grayson out of the boardroom. The once powerful vice president, who had spent years manipulating and controlling others, now had no power at all. The look of fury on his face as he was led away was satisfying. But even more satisfying was the stunned silence that followed. The board members, who had previously turned a blind eye to Grayson's ruthless tactics, looked around at each other uncertain, as if seeing the situation for the first time. The room, once dominated by Grayson's arrogance, now felt different, lighter. Isaac's father, Richard Whitmore, turned to his executives. Let's get one thing straight, he said, his voice even but firm. This company was built on hard work, respect, and loyalty. If anyone here believes that power comes from crushing the people beneath them, you can follow Grayson out the door. A hush fell over the room. Some executives straightened in their seats, guilt flashing across their faces. Others looked at the floor, unwilling to meet Richard's gaze. No one dared to challenge him. Then Richard turned to Isaac. Isaac's heart pounded. His entire life, he had wanted this moment, to be seen by his father, not as a disappointment or an afterthought, but as someone capable, worthy. Richard's expression softened. You were right, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I was so focused on running the company, I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. He shook his head. Grayson was toxic, and if you hadn't exposed him, he would have destroyed everything I spent my life building. Isaac swallowed the lump in his throat. I just wanted to prove I wasn't useless. His father's eyes darkened with regret. Son, he said, I was wrong to ever make you feel that way. The words hit Isaac like a shockwave. For years, he had carried the weight of his father's disappointment, the belief that he would never measure up. And now, for the first time, his father wasn't looking at him with judgment or disapproval. He was looking at him with pride. A hand landed on Isaac's shoulder. He turned to see Sarah, the receptionist who had quietly helped behind the scenes. She gave him a small smile. Told you that you were worth more than a janitor's uniform, she whispered. Isaac let out a breathy laugh. But the moment of relief was short-lived. A commotion erupted outside the boardroom. Raised voices. Then bang! The doors flew open. Grayson stormed back in, his tie loose, his face red with fury. You think you could just throw me out? He snarled. His voice, once polished and controlled, was raw with rage. I made this company what it is. You think you're better than me? His eyes darted wildly between Richard and the executives. All of you sat back and let me take control for years. Now you act like you're innocent. No one spoke. Grayson let out a bitter laugh. You're all cowards, he spat. And you, he turned his glare on Isaac. You think you've won? Isaac met his eyes, refusing to flinch. You're nothing, Grayson hissed. A spoiled brat playing at being a hero. You got lucky. Richard stepped forward. No, Grayson, he said, voice steady. He's not lucky. He's just better than you. The words hit their mark. Grayson flinched. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But then, his gaze flickered to the security guards standing at the door, ready to drag him out again. He sneered. You'll regret this, he muttered before turning on his heel and storming out. This time, he didn't come back. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, slowly, Richard turned to the board members. I think it's time we reconsider who we trust with power, he said, his gaze sweeping across the table. Starting now, there will be changes. Effective immediately, I'll be reviewing all leadership positions. Anyone who enabled Grayson's behavior will have to prove they deserve to stay. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, but no one protested. Richard nodded, satisfied, then turned back to Isaac. And as for you, Isaac braced himself. You've already proven that you understand this company better than most of the people in this room. A small smile played at Richard's lips. I think it's time you stopped cleaning floors and started sitting at the table. A murmur rippled through the room. Isaac's eyes widened. Are you saying, I'm offering you a position? Richard said simply. Not because you're my son, but because you've earned it. For a moment, Isaac was too stunned to respond. All his life, he had struggled to prove himself, to show his father that he was more than just a disappointment. And now, standing here, he realized something. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had always been capable. The only difference was that now, his father could see it too. Isaac straightened his shoulders. I'd be honored. Sarah grinned. About time. The tension in the room finally broke, replaced by something lighter, something new. For the first time, Isaac felt like he truly belonged. And as he walked out of the boardroom, his janitor's uniform still clinging to his shoulders, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. As Isaac walked out of the boardroom, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Not gone, but lighter. For so long, he had carried the burden of his father's expectations, the fear of never being good enough. He had convinced himself that proving his worth meant outshining others, that success was something he had to win. But now, standing here in the very company where he had once been invisible, he realized the truth. Worth wasn't something you earned by stepping over others. It wasn't measured by titles, money, or how loudly people feared you. It was in the choices you made, the integrity you kept when no one was watching. And it had taken working as a janitor, being at the very bottom, to finally understand that. He glanced down at the uniform he still wore. A few weeks ago, he had felt humiliated wearing it, seeing the way people looked right through him. But now, it reminded him of something important. The people who actually kept a company running weren't the ones barking orders in a boardroom. They were the ones no one paid attention to, the janitors, the assistants, the people in the background who work hard without demanding recognition. And those were the people he would never overlook again. Isaac took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Employees who had once ignored him now looked at him differently. Some averted their eyes in shame, others hesitated, as if debating whether to say something. Sarah caught his gaze from across the room and gave him a small nod. "You did it," he smiled back. At that moment, Richard stepped beside him. His father had always been a towering presence, commanding respect with just a stance. But now, Isaac saw him differently, not as an untouchable figure, but as a man who had made mistakes, a man who had learned, and maybe, just maybe, a man who wanted to change. "You ready for this?" Richard asked, watching him carefully. Isaac exhaled. "I don't know." Then a smirk. "But I'm willing to find out." His father chuckled. "Good answer." They started walking side by side. There was still a long road ahead. There would be challenges, people who resented the changes, employees who wouldn't forget that Isaac had once been just a janitor. Some would doubt him. Some would try to push him back down. But that was okay, because now Isaac knew exactly who he was. And no title, no position, no one's opinion could take that away from him. Sometimes, to truly rise, you have to start at the very bottom. And as Isaac walked forward, he knew this was only the beginning.